I knew something was wrong the night the candles in the boy king's room were trimmed too short. I have kept the royal chambers of Thornwell for 31 years, and in that time I have learned that a palace tells the truth in small things long before it speaks it aloud. A draft that should not be there. A door that swings heavier than it did at dawn. A servant who will not meet your eye in a corridor he has walked 1,000 times. That night the candles in the chamber of King Edrin, 8 years old, fatherless since the spring, and the whole of our kingdom's hope balanced on his narrow shoulders, had been cut down to stubs that would gutter out 2 hours before the morning watch. Whoever had done it had wanted that little room to go dark in the deepest part of the night. And the man who had set the new schedule of candles, 3 days before, was the same man who had made himself master of everything in Thornwell, while the king was too young to hold a pen. I did not say a word. I lit fresh tapers from my own cupboard, full and tall, and I set them where the old ones had been. Then I went to find the one man in this whole stone house I still trusted with my fear. His name was Corwin Vale, and he stood the inner door of the king's apartments, the last door, the one no one passes without leave. He was a guardsman of the old discipline, the kind they do not seem to make any longer, spotless coat, hands gloved white, the long ceremonial blade at his hip that had not been drawn in anger in living memory, and a stillness in him that most people mistook for emptiness. They were wrong. I had watched Corwin Vale stand that door through 2 winters and a summer of fever, and I knew that nothing happened in that corridor he did not see. He simply chose, almost always, not to move. I told him about the candles. I expected him to tell me I was a foolish old woman frightened of shadows. Instead, he turned his head a half-inch toward the king's door and was quiet for a long moment. "Who carried them up?" he asked. "A new page, one of Lord Sabrin's." He said nothing more. But I had been near enough men of his trade to know the difference between a guard who is not listening and a guard who has just begun, very quietly, to count. And as I left him there in the lamplight, I understood that I had not brought my fear to a wall after all. I had brought it to the one man in Thornwell who had already noticed. The man who ruled us in all but name was Lord Sabrin of Marrowgate, Lord Protector of the realm, uncle by marriage to the dead king and now guardian of the living one. I will be fair to him because the truth is more frightening when it is fair. He was not a stupid man nor a loud one. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He smiled the way a still pond smiles, showing you only your own reflection and nothing of what moved beneath. When the old king died and left a child on the throne, it was Lord Sabrin who steadied the council, Lord Sabrin who paid the soldiers their back wages, Lord Sabrin who stood at the boy's shoulder during the funeral and let the whole grieving kingdom see a strong hand on a small one. The people loved him for it. The council thanked God for him. And in 8 months he had quietly emptied the palace of everyone who had loved the old king, and filled it with men who loved only Lord Sabrin. The boy's tutor, who had taught 3 generations of the house, was pensioned off to the coast for his health. The captain of the household guard, a gray ox of a man who had carried the king as an infant on his own shoulders, was given a fine new command on the northern border and sent away with a banquet and a medal. The cook who knew the boy would not eat fish was replaced. The nurse who had sung him to sleep since his cradle was retired with a purse and a cottage. One by one, every hand that had known the child as a child rather than a crown was lifted away, until the people closest to the king of Thornwell were strangers who answered to one man. They did not move me, because I keep the chambers and not the king, and no one thinks the woman who folds the linen is worth removing. They did not move Corwin Vale either, and at the time I wondered why. Later I understood. A man so silent looks like furniture. Lord Sabrin had counted Vale as part of the door. It was the most dangerous mistake he ever made. I want to be honest about what I knew and when, because in the months that followed I would be asked, gently and not so gently, to say I had imagined all of it. I did not imagine it, but I want you to understand that none of it was loud. There was no dagger in the dark, no shout in the night, no villain twirling a mustache over a sleeping child. It was quieter than that and far colder. It was a slow tightening, like a hand closing over a candle flame so patiently that the fire does not even feel the warmth leave until the dark is already there. The candles were the first thing I noticed. The locks were the second. A fortnight after the candles, I went to air the king's bedchamber and found that the bolt on the inside of his door, the heavy iron bolt the child himself could throw, the one his father had installed so that even a king of 8 years might have one place in all the world he could make safe with his own hands, was gone. Not broken, removed. The screw holes had been filled with wax and rubbed with soot so they would not show. In its place was a new lock with a smooth brass face and no inside bolt at all. A lock, I realized, holding very still in that bright morning room that could only be worked from the corridor, from the outside, by whoever held the key. I did not light a candle that time. I did not need to. I walked the long way round to the inner door, where Corwin Vale stood his watch, and I told him about the bolt. He listened. Then he asked me one question, in that level voice that gave nothing away. "Who holds the key?" I did not know, but we both did, really. There was only one man in Thornwell who could change a lock on the king's own door and leave no record of the order. And when I said his name aloud at last, Lord Sabrin Corwin Vale looked, for the first time in all the years I had known him, like a man deciding something. "Say nothing of this," he told me. "Not to the council, not to the staff, not to your dearest friend. The moment they know you see it, you will be sent to the coast for your health. And then there will be no one left in this house who is looking." It was the longest speech I had ever heard him make. I understood the weight of it. He was not telling me to be afraid. He was telling me to be useful. There is a great difference, and at my age I was glad to be told there was still a difference left for me. So I held my tongue, and I began to watch the way he watched. And slowly the shape of the thing began to show itself the way a coastline shows through fog, not all at once, but enough, edge by edge, to know what you are sailing toward. The king was being made smaller. That is the only way I know to say it. Lord Sabrin did not lock the boy in a tower, nothing so crude. He simply, gently, week by week, narrowed the world around the child until there was almost nothing of it left that did not pass through his own hand. The council met now in the afternoons when the boy napped, so the king need not tire himself with matters of state. His public appearances grew fewer. When he did appear, it was beside the Lord Protector, and it was the Lord Protector who spoke. New men brought the king his meals, dressed him, walked him to his lessons. The lessons themselves changed. Less history of his own house, less of the old laws that bound even a king, and a great deal more about how a wise young monarch leans upon the counsel of older and wiser men. And there was a paper. I did not see it for a long time, but I learned of it the way you learn of a coming storm, from the way the men beneath the storm begin to behave. There was a document being prepared, very carefully, by lawyers loyal to Marrowgate. A document that, signed and sealed, would extend the Lord Protector's regency far past the boy's coming of age, into his manhood, into his marriage, perhaps for the whole of his life, on the gentle, fatherly grounds that the young king was of a delicate constitution and a nervous disposition, and would need a steady guardian beside the throne for many years yet. Delicate, nervous. The boy I knew climbed the orchard wall to steal early apples and skinned both knees and did not cry. But it does not matter what a king truly is. It matters what the men around him can make the kingdom believe. And every locked door, every short candle, every meal carried by a stranger, every appearance where the child stood silent while another man spoke for him, was a single small stone in a wall being built around one idea, that the king of Thornwell could not be trusted to rule himself. A frightened, isolated, silent child is easy to call delicate, and a man who controls the candles, the locks, the food, the tutors, and the doors can manufacture a frightened, isolated, silent child without ever once raising his hand. That was the plot, not a knife, a story. They meant to write the king out of his own reign with ink and patience, and never spill a drop of blood, so that no one could ever point to a crime, only to a kind and weary protector who had given his whole life to a poor delicate boy. I understood it at last on a gray afternoon in autumn, standing in the cold king's bedchamber with its outside lock and its short candles and its stripped, strange, friendless air. And the understanding nearly broke me, because I could see no way to fight a war that had no battle in it. You cannot raise the alarm against a man for being kind. You cannot accuse him of locking a door for the child's own safety. Every cruelty had a gentle face. I carried my despair to the inner door that evening, the way I carried everything now. And I found Corwin Vale exactly as I always found him, still, white-gloved, eyes forward, a part of the stone. But the king's door behind him stood open a hand's width, which was not allowed, and from within I could hear, very softly, a sound I had not heard in that wing in months. The boy was laughing. I stepped close enough to see. King Edrin of Thornwell, 8 years old and the loneliest soul in the kingdom, was sitting cross-legged just inside his own doorway. And the great silent guardsman, who was forbidden by every rule of his service to so much as turn his head, was still standing his post, eyes forward, hands at his sides, perfectly correct, perfectly motionless. But his foot in its mirror-polished boot, was very slowly and very deliberately nudging a wooden soldier across the threshold, an inch at a time, toward the boy's reaching hand, and then nudging it back. A game. A tiny, secret, soundless game, played entirely with the toe of a boot by a man who had not, by any rule anyone could name, broken his post or moved from it or spoken a single word. The king caught the toy and laughed again, and Corwin Vale's eyes stayed forward, and his face did not move. But I saw the thing the Lord Protector had never bothered to see, because he had counted this man as furniture. The boy was not alone. As long as that door was watched, the boy was not alone. And the man watching it had quietly decided that whatever was being built in this house, it would not be built across him. I went away and wept in the linen room, and they were not all sad tears. But I was not a fool, and neither was Vale, and we both knew that a kind foot and a wooden soldier do not stop a man like Lord Sabrin of Marrowgate. So I will tell you now how a guardsman who never moved fought a war that had no battle in it, and won it without once breaking the oath that held him to that door. He began by remembering everything. I did not understand at first what he was doing, because he did not appear to be doing anything at all. He stood his watch. He said nothing. But I came to learn that behind that unmoving face Corwin Vale was keeping a ledger more exact than any clerk's. He knew which page carried the king's supper, and at what hour, and whether it had passed through the still room first. He knew which of the new servants lingered at the door and which hurried by. He knew that Lord Sabrin's physician, a soft, scented man named Dr. Pell, who had appeared in the household around the time the talk of a delicate constitution began, visited the king twice a week, and brought with him a small case of brown bottles, and that the boy was quieter and paler in the days after each visit. He could not search the case. He could not question the doctor. He could not leave his post to follow anyone or open anyone's bag. He was one guardsman at one door, bound by an oath he would not bend, in a house owned by his enemy. By every measure of power he had none at all. But a man at a door sees everyone who passes through it, and a man who is trusted to be furniture is told things that no one would say in front of a person. So Corwin Vale watched, and counted, and remembered, and waited for the plot to make the one mistake that every plot must finally make. He waited for it to need a witness it could not control. The first crack came over the brown bottles. I have served sick rooms and well rooms both, and I know the smell of a tonic that is meant to heal, and the smell of one that is meant only to settle. The little glasses Dr. Pell left for the king had the second smell, a heavy, sweetish, sleeping smell, and after each visit the boy did not climb the orchard wall. He did not steal apples. He sat by the window with his hands in his lap and looked at nothing, and when his uncle, the Lord Protector, brought visitors to the door to glimpse the poor delicate child, that is exactly what they saw. A poor, delicate, drowsy child who could not be expected to rule. They were not poisoning him. I want to be clear, because the truth is bad enough without my making it worse. There was never any attempt to harm the boy and his body. That was never the plot, and Lord Sabran was not clumsy. What they were doing was quieter and, in its way, colder. They were dimming him, keeping the brightest child in the kingdom muffled and slow and silent on the days that mattered, so that the kingdom would learn to think of its king as a flickering, failing thing, and to be grateful for the strong, steady man who carried his burdens for him. A dim child cannot defend himself, because he does not even know he is being dimmed. And a man like Corwin Vale, who could not search a bag or question a doctor or leave his post, could not stop the little glasses from coming. But he could change who held them. It was done so simply that I did not see the genius of it until afterward. The tonic was prepared by Dr. Pell and carried up by a page, and at the king's door it was handed across to whoever waited within to give it to the boy. For a long time that had been one of Lord Sabran's new servants, but servants change and rosters drift, and a guardsman who never speaks is the last person anyone suspects of moving the pieces on the board. Corwin Vale never gave a single order that could be traced. He simply, over weeks, made himself useful in 100 tiny invisible ways until the household's own habits did the work, until it became natural, unremarkable, beneath anyone's notice, that the king's evening tonic was received at the inner door, and that the person who carried it the last few steps to the child was the old woman who kept the chambers. It was received by me. And I, who had folded that boy's linen since he was small enough to fit in a single basket, did not give him a drop of it. I poured Dr. Pell's heavy sweet sleep into the night soil, and I gave the King of Thornwell warm milk with honey, and I held my breath every evening for a month, waiting to be caught. We were not caught, because no one was watching the watchers. Lord Sabran had built a machine of locked doors and short candles and brown bottles and gentle lies, and like all such men, he had forgotten that a machine still has to be tended by hands, and that not all hands are loyal to the man who thinks he owns them. The boy came back to himself slowly, the way a fire comes back when you stop smothering it. The color returned to his face. The questions returned to his mouth. And one gray afternoon, sitting cross-legged in his doorway, while a wooden soldier traveled back and forth across the threshold on the toe of a polished boot, the King of Thornwell said something that made my heart stop in my chest. "Vale," he said, for of course the boy knew the silent man's name. Children always know the names of the people who are truly there. "Vale, why does my uncle want me to be sick?" I froze in the corridor, with a basket of linen on my hip. Corwin Vale did not turn his head. His eyes stayed forward as the oath required. But he answered the king, very low, without moving his lips more than a breath. "Your Majesty has a sharp eye," he said. "Keep it sharp and keep it hidden." A king who sees everything and shows nothing is the hardest king in the world to govern. The boy thought about that. He was 8, but he was not stupid, and he had been lonely long enough to have done a great deal of thinking. "Like you," he said. "Like me," said Corwin Vale, to the empty air in front of him, and nudged the wooden soldier 1 inch closer to the child's hand. I tell you this because it is the heart of the whole matter, and because the men who later tried to make me say I had imagined all of it never understood it for a moment. The Lord Protector's entire plot rested on one belief, that the king was a thing to be managed, a weak vessel, a delicate, nervous, governable boy. And the one man Lord Sabran had counted as furniture was, quietly, at the cost of nothing but his own endless patience, teaching that boy to be a king, not by breaking his oath, not by leaving his post, not by raising a hand or a voice, By standing the door and seeing everything and showing nothing, and letting a lonely child learn what strength looks like by watching it stand watch over him every single night. That, in the end, was what undid Lord Sabran of Marrowgate, not a guardsman with a sword, a king who had learned to keep his eyes sharp and hidden. But I am ahead of the story, and the cruelest part of it is still to come, because a patient man with a kingdom nearly in his hand does not lose it gently. He grows impatient at the end. They always do. And when the paper was ready at last, the great document of the extended regency, sealed and lawyered and very nearly done, Lord Sabran made the one move that a careful man should never make. He set a date. The signing was to be a grand and gentle thing, of course. Everything Marrowgate did wore a gentle face. There would be a council and a small ceremony, and the kind Lord Protector would stand beside the poor delicate young king, and the lords of Thornwell would put their seals to a paper that secured the realm against the dangers of a too early reign. And on that day, before all the great men of the kingdom, the boy was to be seen to be exactly what they had spent a year making him appear to be. Silent, fragile, frightened, leaning on his uncle's arm because he could not stand alone. For that they needed the boy dimmed, truly dimmed deeply, on the one morning of all mornings that the kingdom's lords would be watching his face. And so, 3 days before the signing, Dr. Pell's visits were doubled, and the brown bottles came thicker, and a stronger draft was ordered for the night before the ceremony. A draft meant to leave the king heavy and slow and stumbling for the lords to pity. It all came, as everything came, to the inner door, and it all came, as everything now came, into the hands of the woman who kept the chambers. I should have simply poured the strong draft away as I had poured all the others, but I was afraid, that week in a way I had not been before, because the stakes had a date on them now, and a date is a terrible thing. And so I made a mistake. I went to Corwin Vale at his post in the daylight where I should not have lingered, and I let my fear show on my face where anyone might read it. And someone did. Dr. Pell, coming late up the corridor with his little case of bottles, saw the keeper of the chambers standing too close to the silent guard, with fear written plain across her old face. And the soft-scented man was not a fool. He went straight to Lord Sabran. By that evening, I was relieved of the king's tonic. A new man, one of the Lord Protector's own, hard-eyed and silent in a way that had nothing of Vale's stillness in it, was set to receive the bottles at the inner door and to carry them himself to the king. And word came down, gentle and final, that the keeper of the chambers was to be pensionied to the coast at the end of the month, for her health, with the kingdom's thanks for her long and faithful service. I had become the witness the plot could not control, and so, like everyone before me, I was being lifted quietly away. I went to the inner door that night to say what I thought would be my goodbye, and to tell Corwin Vale that I had failed, that the last friendly hand near the boy was being struck from the board, that the strong draft would reach the king now whatever either of us did, and that in 3 days a kingdom would watch a drugged child lean on the arm of the man who had stolen his reign, and call it mercy. Vale heard me out. He did not look at me. His eyes were forward, as they always were, and when I had finished, he was silent for so long that I thought he had nothing left to give me but the silence. Then he said, very quietly, the only thing he ever asked of me in all those months. "When they pension you off," he said, "do not go to the coast. Go to the old captain, the gray one they sent to the northern border. Tell him everything you have seen, the candles, the bolt, the bottles, the milk and the honey, the date on the paper, all of it in order in your own hand and signed. He carried the king on his shoulder once. He will know what to do with the truth. I cannot leave this door, you can. That is why they made you furniture too, and that is the mistake." I understood then what he had been building all those patient months. Not a wall around the boy, a witness chain, a line of small, overlooked furniture people, a chamber keeper, a milk and honey, a wooden soldier, an exiled captain on a far border, strung together so quietly that the man who owned the palace never saw the thread until it was already around his throat. "And the signing," I whispered. "In 3 days the draft, the boy." For the first time in all the years I had served beside him, Corwin Vale almost smiled. It did not reach his mouth, which stayed correct and still as ever. It reached only his eyes, and only for a moment. "The boy," he said, "has learned to keep his eyes sharp and hidden. Leave the signing to His Majesty, and to the door." I did as I was told. I am only the keeper of the chambers. I have always done as I was told. But this once I did it for the right master. I packed my small life into a single trunk, and I did not weep where anyone could see. And on the morning I was to leave for the coast I drove instead, with my purse and my pension and my one good cloak, to the cold northern border where the gray old captain kept his fine and useless command. His name was Galen Marsh, and he had carried the king as an infant on his own shoulder, and Lord Sabran had sent him a medal and a banquet and a posting at the end of the world to be rid of him. I found him on a windy rampart staring south toward the capital. He was no longer allowed to serve. A great square-built ox of a man going gray at the temples, and I put into his hands a letter I had written through the night in my own plain script. The candles, the bolt, the bottles, the milk and the honey, the toe of a polished boot and a wooden soldier crossing a threshold, a king who asked why his uncle wanted him to be sick, a document of extended regency, sealed and lawyered with a date on it, and the date. Galen Marsh read it standing up in the wind, and I watched a year of helpless rage go out of that old soldier's face, and something far steadier come into it. When he finished, he folded the letter once, very carefully, and looked at me with eyes that had gone bright and terrible. "He left one door watched," the captain said, almost to himself. "All this while the clever devil left one door watched and never knew it. He put the letter inside his coat against his heart. 'Madam, you have ridden 3 days to bring me a kingdom. Now ride back and rest. The rest of this is soldier's work, and it is owed.'" Lord Sabran had emptied the palace of the king's friends and scattered them to the corners of the realm. He had never once considered that scattered friends can write to one another, and that a man with nothing to do but stand on a cold rampart has a very great deal of time to plan. Galen Marsh had spent 8 months memorizing exactly which men of the household guard were loyal to a boy rather than to a regent, and writing to them, quietly, one careful letter at a time. I did not see the signing. I learned of it the way the whole kingdom learned of it, but I learned the true shape of it later from Corwin Vale himself, in the only long conversation we ever had. So let me give it to you as he gave it to me plainly, the way a guardsman tells a thing. The morning of the signing dawned bright and cold. The great hall of Thornwell was hung with the house colors, and the lords of the realm came in their best, and there was a long table at the head of the hall with the document upon it, the great paper that would extend the Lord Protector's hand over the king for the rest of his natural life, and a chair beside it for the boy, and a place of honor for the kind and weary uncle who had given so much for so little a child. The night before, the strong draft had been carried to the king's door by Lord Sabran's hard-eyed new man, and handed across, and carried the last few steps to the boy. And the boy, who had learned to keep his eyes sharp and hidden, who had spent a year being dimmed, and a season being quietly brought back to himself by warm milk and a wooden soldier and a man at a door, the boy took the little glass, and thanked the hard-eyed man very prettily, and waited until he had gone. And then King Edrin of Thornwell, 8 years old, poured his uncle's sleep into the cold ashes of his own hearth, exactly as he had watched an old woman do it 100 times through a door left open a careful hand's width. He had seen everything. He had shown nothing. He had been taught, by the one man Lord Sabran counted as furniture, the single skill that a captured king most needs. He had been taught to appear to obey. So on the morning of the signing, the lords of Thornwell did not see a drugged and drowsy child stumbling on his uncle's arm. They saw the king. He came into the great hall on his own 2 feet, in his father's colors, with his chin level and his eyes bright and sharp, and a year of careful lies died in the hall the moment the lords looked at his face. This was no delicate, nervous, failing boy. This was a clear-eyed child who walked to the head of the table without leaning on anyone at all, and stood before the great paper, and looked at it, and then looked up at the whole assembled nobility of his kingdom with a calm that silenced the room. Lord Sabran of Marrowgate, for the first time in his careful life, did not know what to say. "My lords," said the king in a voice that did not shake, and Corwin Vale told me he had drilled the boy on that, on nothing else, only on this, that whatever you feel you let none of it into the voice, the way a guardsman lets none of it into his face. "My lords, I am told I am too delicate to rule. I am told I am nervous and weak, and that I sleep too much and start at shadows and cannot be trusted with my own door." He let that sit. "Who told you so?" No one answered. The whole gilded hall held its breath. "My uncle told you so," said the king. "And my uncle's doctor, who brings me bottles that make a boy sleep on the days that matter. And my uncle's servants, who took the bolt off my door so that I could not lock it from the inside, and trimmed my candles short so that my room would go dark in the night, and carried away every soul who ever knew me before I wore this." He set one small hand flat on the great paper. "I am 8 years old, my lords. I am not too delicate to rule. I have simply been governed by a man who needed me to seem so, and I will not put my hand to this. It is one thing for an old woman to write the truth in a letter. It is another for a frightened lord to risk his lands and his neck on it." The hall might still have gone the Lord Protector's way, a child's word against a regent's, a boy overwrought, a strange outburst. "You see, my lords, how nervous he is." Lord Sabran was already reaching for exactly that, his still-pond face composing itself into pity, his soft voice gathering to soothe and to dismiss. And then the great doors of the hall opened, and Galen Marsh came in. He came in his old uniform, the one from before the medal and the banishment, and he was not alone. Behind him came the king's true men, the scattered, exiled, pensioned, paid-off friends of a dead king and a living boy, summoned by an old captain's patient letters, and the truth carried north in an old woman's plain hand. The tutor who had been sent to the coast. The nurse with her purse in her cottage. 2 gray sergeants of the old household guard. They were not an army. They had no swords drawn. This was a hall of law, not a battlefield, and Corwin Vale's whole long lesson had been that the war without a battle is one without one. They were only witnesses. But they were witnesses the plot could not control, every single one of them, walking into the one room where the plot had finally been forced into the light. And each of them carried, in hand or in memory, one more small true thing that no still-pond smile could explain away. Galen Marsh walked the length of that silent hall to the head of the table, and he laid down beside the great unsigned paper, a second paper, my letter and the tutor's account, and the nurses and the sergeants, and the long careful record an exiled captain had kept of every loyal friend a frightened regent had scattered to the winds. He laid the truth down next to the lie, where the lords of the kingdom could read both side by side. And then the gray old ox of a man, who had carried this king on his shoulder when the boy was small enough to hold in 2 hands, went down on one knee before the child and bowed his head, and did not get up. One by one, down the length of that hall, the lords of Thornwell rose from their places, looked from the clear-eyed boy to the unsigned paper to the kneeling captain, and chose. And the Lord Protector's whole patient, bloodless, gentle-faced plot came apart not with a battle but with the worst sound such a plot can ever hear, the sound of one chair scraping back, and then another, and then the whole room as the men he had counted upon stood up and stood instead with the king. There was no violence. There is never any violence in the true telling of it, and that is the part I most want you to remember. No blade was drawn in that hall. Corwin Vale was not even in it. He was where he always was, at the inner door of the king's empty apartments, standing his post, his eyes forward, his hands at his sides, having never once in the whole long year left the door he was sworn to keep. He did not need to be in the hall. He had already done his work there, months before, an inch at a time, with the toe of a boot and a wooden soldier and a single quiet sentence about keeping a sharp eye hidden. The boy carried the door into the hall with him. The boy was the door. Lord Sabran of Marrowgate did not rage even then. I will give him that to the last. He looked at the standing lords and the kneeling captain and the clear-eyed boy, and his still-pond face showed at last the thing that had always moved beneath it, and it was not love of the realm, and it was not care for a delicate child. It was the cold, flat disappointment of a man who has done his sums perfectly and discovered, too late, one figure he forgot to carry. He had counted the council, the doctors, the servants, the locks, the candles, the law. He had counted everyone in Thornwell who mattered. He had counted the silent guardsman as part of the door, and the old woman as part of the linen, and the exiled captain as part of the past, and the boy as part of the furniture of his own reign. He had counted wrong. The Council of Thornwell did the rest, as councils do, with a great many careful words. The document of extended regency was burned in the hall's own hearth, unsigned. Dr. Pell's bottles were taken and tested, and found to be exactly what an old woman's nose had always known them to be. The Lord Protector was relieved of his protectorship, in light of his long labors and the king's evident strength, which is the gentle language such men are always granted on their way out, the same gentle language he had used on everyone he sent to the coast. He kept his head and his lands and went home to Marrowgate, and was never again admitted past the outer gates of the palace he had so nearly owned. The gray Captain Gallon Marsh was brought back from the border and given the command of the household guard he should never have lost. The tutor came home. The nurse came home. And I came home, though I had been pensioned, though my trunk was packed, though I was meant by every plan to be growing old by the sea. The king himself signed the order that kept me, the first order he ever signed entirely in his own hand, and I have it still. It says only that the keeper of the chambers of Thornwell is to keep them for as long as she wishes, by the king's particular wish, for reasons his majesty knows and need not write. He was 9 years old by then. He had already learned to keep his reasons sharp and hidden. I asked Corwin Vale, once, in that single long conversation we ever had, how he had borne it, the whole long year of it, standing a door, seeing everything, able to stop almost none of it with his own 2 hands, forbidden by his oath to so much as turn his head while a kingdom was quietly stolen from a child 3 feet behind his back. He thought about it for a while, in the way he thought about everything, as if the question were a corridor and he meant to watch the whole length of it before he answered. "A guardsman protects the king's person," he said at last. "Any fool with a sword can do that on the day there is a sword. The hard duty, the one they do not give you a medal for, because no one ever sees it happen, is to protect the king's self, the boy inside the crown." They were not trying to kill him. They were trying to erase him, one candle and one lock and one little glass at a time, until there was nothing left in that room but a frightened thing in a chair that another man could speak for. I could not stop the candles. I could not stop the bottles. I could not leave my post, and I would not break my oath. He paused. But I could stand the door. And as long as one man is truly standing the door, seeing him and showing nothing and being, every single night, one true thing in a house full of liars, then the boy is not alone. And a king who is not alone is a king they cannot erase. That is the whole of it, madam. I just stood the door. He stood it for 30 more years. He stood it through the king's coming of age, which came right on the proper day, with no extended regency and no kind, weary uncle, only a young man taking up his own reign in his own 2 hands. He stood it through the king's marriage and the birth of the king's own children, and I am told, for I was very old by then and kept the chambers no longer, that on the day the old guardsman finally laid down his post, the king of Thornwell, a grown man now and a good one, came down himself to the inner door, and did the thing his uncle had never once thought a guardsman might be worth, and the thing the whole kingdom would remember of his reign. He stood at the door beside the old man, and he kept the watch with him for one last hour in silence. A king standing a door, for the guardsman who had stood it for him when he was small and frightened and very nearly erased. There was no metal in it. There never is for the door that is truly kept. The histories of Thornwell say only that the boy king came early into his strength, put aside a too ambitious regent, and reigned long and well. They do not mention the candles, or the bolt, or the milk and the honey, or the wooden soldier crossing a threshold on the toe of a polished boot. But I was there, and I kept the chambers, and I have written it down at last in my own plain hand, the way I once wrote it for an old captain on a cold rampart in the north. And if you remember nothing else of it, remember this, because it is the truest thing I know after a life lived in the shadow of a throne. The loudest crimes are not the ones that take a kingdom. A kingdom is taken quietly, kindly, with a smile and a sealed paper, and a hand closing slowly over a small flame. And it is saved the same way, not by a hero with a drawn sword, but by a man who simply will not look away from the door he is sworn to keep, and who knows the difference between guarding a king's body and guarding a king's soul. Corwin Vale never broke his oath. He never left his post. He never raised his hand or his voice. He just stood the door. And because he stood it, a frightened child became a good king. And the men who counted him as furniture learned, too late, that the most dangerous thing in any palace is a quiet man who is truly paying attention.